Hello Year 8 and welcome to your next lesson on the period 1750 to 1900. This lesson is called Let's Go Live in Leeds. So the aim obviously is to look at now, given what we know already about the changes in the period, why towns in Britain grew so rapidly, particularly in the north. So have a look at the image on the slide, on the video. It's a little cartoon from the period. You will need to pause the video to do this, and we've got two questions that I want you to answer once you've written down the title at the end of the day. The first thing you're looking for is, what does the source suggest about life in the countryside? And two, what do you think the whispering figure A represents and B is saying to the person in this image? A good thing to do would be simply to start off by identifying the key things you can see in this image to draw your assumptions about what message it's trying to give. So pause the video now, answer these two questions. So if we look carefully at the source I've just asked you to study, you will hopefully have spotted certain key things. So obviously, if you look in the bottom left hand corner of the image, we see a body on the ground. This is presumably this man's wife. She is clearly dead and dressed up as if to be buried, hence the kind of dark and gloomy tone of the image. Obviously, if we look at the central figure, this guy is actually called Rick Burner. We can see he has three small children he needs to care for. Four small children, sorry, I forgot the fourth one. They are obviously sad, they're clearly unkempt, they are obviously a very poor family, they are struggling with the basics of life. On the right hand side, we see there are bars on the window, suggesting this cottage is almost like a prison. It's certainly not a lovely country cottage that you'd possibly want to go and stay in. It is quite a dark and destitute scenario. And this shadowy figure in the back is presented a bit like a devil, almost like the idea of the dark side of his consciousness. Clearly the image is suggesting something to him, hence the whispering tone. And it's most likely, the whole point of this image is it's suggesting that life in the countryside is incredibly difficult at this time. It's very hard. So the image is probably whispering to Rick Burner, suggesting he leaves his home behind, leaves everything his family has ever known. This is probably where he's grown up, his parents have grown up. Leave the village he's known for so long and move elsewhere to find probably work and a better life for him and his children, because there's now, it seems, nothing left for him. So hopefully you can add some extra points to your description, to your explanation. Can you pause the video briefly and just add a few things on, ideally in green pen or any pen that you have to hand. So that image is obviously the starting point for what we're now going to look at, the rapid growth of towns and cities from 1750. And it's a good starting point because it's the position that most people will have started off in this period. Life in the countryside at this time was incredibly difficult because of industrialisation. People who'd had industries in weaving and cottage industries found they could no longer feed their families. So the obvious solution then was to move to a town. But if we start looking at these towns and how much they grew, on the screen in front of you now you have the population of Leeds from 1750 to 1851, and you've got some key questions. Again, before we look at the questions, the key term you should be looking at as well is urbanisation. This should be a term you may have come across in geography. Urbanisation literally means the growth of urban areas, towns and cities. So let's look back at this data for Leeds. So you've got a chart and three little questions, two questions and an extension to do. So first, look at the chart. Can you now describe how Leeds grew between 1750 and 1851? Can you write that as a full sentence? If you want, this would be a bit of extra maths, can you now express this as percentage growth? I'm not going to give you any guidance on that, that's just a little maths task. And your third task, extension task, could you possibly predict, using this data, almost looking at it as if it's a pattern, can you predict what the population of Leeds would be like in 1901? So add on another 50 years. So look at how Leeds has grown over these 3 50-year periods. Write down how big you think Leeds would be by 1901. Again, pause the video now and complete those 3 little quick tasks. So moving on from our 2 starting points, our image of Rick Burner and then the fact that Leeds grew, one question we need to ask is, but why live in Leeds? As the little caption says, yes, it was better than living in Bradford. Before anyone starts complaining, I am from Bradford, I grew up there. I'm allowed to say it's rubbish because it is. So, at the time, Leeds, why use Leeds? Leeds is a very typical Birmingham, all experienced huge population booms. In places like Leeds, Bradford, even Manchester to some extent, these places were not huge settlements before 1750. Yes, they were larger than some of the smaller towns, but they were nowhere near the size of London or York or any of the traditional cities. So this industrial period meant these cities grew up incredibly quickly, almost from nothing. And if we look at why go live in Leeds, the simple answer here would be that factories created jobs for people and people moved to work. But it's a bit too simple to say that everyone just moved to these towns and cities just because a factory opened up. What we need to look at is this idea of that factories build towns, and the basic premise is that with the location of a factory or these heavy industries, this drew people into the area. The people drawn into the area obviously needed more than just somewhere to work, so this had a knock-on effect to other things that needed to happen. So as the industry grows and as the population grows, so does the population, not just of the factory workers, but all the people associated around them, and also all the requirements, provisions and amenities that go around them. So we've got this is your first main task. So on the right hand side of your screen you will see a diagram. On the next part of the video, this diagram is going to be presented as a full screen image, so it'll make it a bit easier for you to see. But the key task I want you to, tasks I want you to do now. First one, I want you to draw your own quick version of this diagram in your book or on paper. It doesn't have to have the little pictures. Effectively, what you have here is a flow diagram. So you start with a factory. This then leads to people who work there. As you see on the third tier, they then need houses, transport and shops. These 3 things then lead to the arrival of people like builders and so on. So you need to draw your own copy of this flow diagram. Then once you've done this, I want you to explain this process, so do a written version of this development, and I want you to use the historical narrative method that you used for the agricultural revolution lesson. So basically you start with factories were built in towns where it was suitable for their location. This led to, and then your next stage would be people moved to the town to work in the factories because the wages are better. This then led to, and you explain the next tier and the next tier. So ultimately, where you see these little orange arrows on the diagram, think of those orange arrows as a prompt to write this led to. So just make sure you know what the task is. The image will be on the next slide. You will need to pause the video so you can actually see it and work from it. And what we would like you to do is submit your written account, your written explanation onto Google Classroom. That would be your first submittable task. So as promised, here is the large copy of the diagram for you to look at. It is slightly stretched, apologies for that. So pause the video now and complete those 2 tasks, the copy of the flow diagram and the written explanation of how towns grew. So just to bring this task to an end and have a quick review, ultimately we're looking at two things. Can you now explain, have you explained how the Industrial Revolution led to the growth of towns, this urban revolution? Ask yourself, do you fully understand the term urbanisation? Could you use it in a sentence? Could you use it in conversation? And the next thing we really need to think of is, why else might people move to Leeds? The long story short is that just because the growth of factories led to more jobs, that doesn't explain why people necessarily moved to Leeds. Yes, it was the case for some people, but not all. And as we know, as good historians, giving one reason is never really enough. So we've already looked at two of these broad ideas already. When you're explaining the cause of growth, particularly of towns, we need to be quite careful. We need to consider these reasons, and we look at them in two different ways, and this is definitely the case for geography as well. So we look at push factors. These are reasons to leave a certain place. So in this case we would be looking at no jobs, famine, wars are a good reason to leave a place. We also look at pull factors, reasons to go to a certain place. For example, job opportunities, family already there, prospects. These two are not necessarily the same. So, as I alluded earlier, I am from Bradford, so I no longer live in Bradford. There are push factors for me to leave Bradford, partly that there wasn't a lot going on, there were limited prospects for me there, and Bradford was slowly, when I moved, collapsing into a big hole. Pull factors would be a reason for me to go elsewhere, and obviously in this case Manchester. So a pull factor why I came to Manchester was that there was a job for me here at Parrs Woods. I knew people in the city already. The pull factors aren't reasons why I left Bradford. Pull factors are what drew me to Manchester as opposed to somewhere like London or Birmingham. So it's quite important before we move on that you understand push factors, reasons to leave, pull factors, reasons to go somewhere once you've left your original place. So to help understand these ideas of push and pull factors a bit more carefully, we're going to look at a specific family. This is the Dyson family. There they are, there's a picture of them. They are actually a real family. There's a lot of document evidence about them. If you ever get the chance to go to the Thackeray Medical Museum in Leeds, there's quite a lot of detail about them. We know quite a bit. So this is the Dyson family. They left the countryside surrounding Leeds. They didn't travel that far and they moved into Leeds. And this family have their own push and pull factors. So you will need to open the document that's called Push and Pull Factors. On there you will see a series of statements. Once you've opened this document, you need to draw in your book or on whatever method you're working in the chart that's in front of you. One column for push factors, one column for pull factors. What you need to do is read the information carefully and write them under the correct heading. Identify which are push factors, which are pull factors, write them on the chart. Ideally, as well as an extension task, can you identify which one you think was the most important factor specific to the Dysons? So this is why you need to read it quite carefully. So you will need to pause this video while you do that. This chart is the second thing we'd like you to upload onto Google Classroom. So pause the video now, open the push and pull factors document and complete the chart, please. So just to round things off, we've got 3 little questions that you can write answers to. You don't necessarily need to submit these, but it will help you to just clarify things. So the first question from this now, can you explain why cities like Leeds grew so much between 1750 and 1900? Then, using the example of the Dysons, can you take out 3 reasons from their story why Leeds grew? And then finally, do you know or can you comfortably use, are you confident using the terms urbanisation, industrial revolution, agricultural revolution? What we could do really is add on the word revolution to urban. So an urban revolution, this is the growth of towns. So make sure you can do all those 3 things. And there, just as a final point, as you can see, There are the Dysons again. They've now moved to Leeds, and as you can see, it's not really that great when they moved there. So this will be more of what happens next week. So make sure you submit your work back to Google Classroom. Please don't simply press return with an empty post. We do need to see your work. And until next week, thank you very much and goodbye.